What do you think the best way to buy cheap land is?
The best way to buy cheap land, depends on the context of what's cheap and where you're at and what you want, I would say. People, they stop there. And I've had that phone call, and agents have, and appraisers, our offices, you name it, many, many times. And it's like, okay, let's ask me the question. Where do you think the best way is to find cheap land or to buy cheap land? It's like, okay, question. What do you want to buy for land? Is it hunting land? Is it buildable land? Is it duck hunting land or deer hunting land? Is it tillable farmland? What is it that you're after in cheap land? If you want cheap land, you can go to the middle of nowhere desert and get it pretty darn cheap for a few bucks an acre. But is that what you're really after if you can't get to it, or, there's no utility to it? So cheap land is, really define what cheap is and where it is. And then many times that would progress to, I want cheap farmland, cheaper than the market. Or I want cheap hunting land that I can go to and go deer hunting or have a cabin on or something like that. So defining cheap land, and then cheap compared to what and in what area. Once that part is solved, then it's like, okay, let's say land's going for $10,000 an acre, and you want to buy tillable farmland. We'll start there, and then I'll do the hunting land example. Tillable farmland in whatever county, whatever state, $10,000 per acre, just for the round example. If you say, okay, I want to buy cheap land, I want to buy it for $5,000 an acre, it's like, okay, if that's the goal and you want to buy cheap, then you have to look at and say, okay, where could I find $5,000 per acre land? I could find it. Maybe it's been on the market for 2 years and it needs a lot of work. Okay, what's a lot of work? Is it grubbing trees? Is it taking care of tile issues? Is it taking care of fertility issues, or does it have problems? I sold a cheap piece of land one time, but it had no soil quality. There was no CPI, no CSR2, because it was a previous mine, and that mine, the soil quality just was unmeasurable. It still grew crops and it was cheap, but a bank wasn't really willing to do great financing on it. So the person bought it on a contract for deed because no one else bought it, and that property had been on the market for years. And people like, hey, it's an old, I forget what it was called, but it was an old quarry. And it's like, we don't know if this is going to be able to be farmed. It had wetland problems, it had some other problems. So the buyer wanted cheap land and wanted to roll the dice on that and their opportunity to turn it into a higher quality future piece of ground. So you can look at property that's been on the market overpriced for a long time. A lot of times the sellers become more realistic in time, and then end up selling property for less than it might be worth. Another strategy would be negotiating correctly, even if it's on a public listing, negotiating correctly with the agent and saying, like, what works for the seller? What do they really want? Because a lot of times we find that money isn't what they want nearly as much as the right buyer, the right person that's going to do what they intend for the land to have in the future, compared to something else happens with it. So not necessarily going in with a price right off the bat, but going in with a question of what would the seller love to see happen on this? Like, I might not be the highest priced buyer, as an example, somebody might say that, and then like, what do they want? And then I'll make an offer according to that. They would love this to stay farmland forever and love a beginning farmer to buy it, or they would love to save money on capital gains tax and they don't have any debt on it. So contract for deed might be an option, something like that. So like, identifying what is more important than money to someone can very well turn into an opportunity for a lower purchase price. But on the hunting land side, again, cheap land, you can go find cheap land if it's for deer hunting that might not ever have a big deer on it because it has, neighbors that have dogs or trespassing, issues or whatever it may be, running the deer out of there. Like the cheap hunting land is like, okay, in whatever case, if premium price is here and low price is here, am I willing to sacrifice those things? Are they worth it for the price difference? Or should I just go buy less acres initially to get into my price point? That might make a lot of sense. Or figure out a different way to make the price that seems high, more stomachable. So what I mean by that is, if you take a timber property, a hunting property, and then you remove timber from it and do a timber harvest, does that reduce the land? So it was, $8,000 an acre and you took $3,000 in timber off. Is that cheap now? Because you took $3,000 off, it's cheaper. Another one would be, well, the payment is too high. Okay, let's figure out a different way to make the payment to where it isn't just 100% on me as the buyer doing the financing. So, there's no, if land was cheap, or, how to find cheap land. It's kind of like the topic of, if it was that easy, everybody'd be doing it. And then if everybody was doing it, land prices would go up. So if you want to go try to find cheap land, try to find an opportunity that hasn't sold, it's been on the market for a long time, that has a seller, that has something more important to them than money, if you're indeed trying to get it lower, or find a different use for something to make it more valuable than what you might have previously thought. I would say those are the three things important after you really take the time to identify where and what is most important to you when looking for cheap land.